I'd like to just welcome each and every one of you for joining. Thank you so much for coming on this Thursday evening, Erev Shabbat, Erev Parshat Zachar. We're getting close to Purim. The sun is shining. There's optimism in the air. And Parshat Teruma is an amazing, amazing Parsha full of so many interesting things. So I'm so delighted to welcome each and every one of you. So the plan is this evening, try and focus on the Parsha of the week. And then towards the end, we'll talk a tiny bit about Parshat Zachar. And for those of you who will be in Shul on Shabbat, between Mincha and Marav, I'll be giving a bit of a Shiur on Purim. But that is the plan. So if you can hear me, just give you a thumbs up so everyone can hear me loud and clear. We're all good. That is fantastic. Okay, so this week's Sedra, Parshas Teruma. Now it's interesting, there are 4 portions in the Torah dedicated to the Mishkan, the temporary temple, the tabernacle. It's an interesting thing when you think about it. There are only 37 verses in Bereshis which describe the concept of the entire creation of the world, but yet we have 4 parshiot describing this temporary tabernacle in the Mishkan. As Galileo said, the Bible teaches us the path to heaven, not how the Bible teaches us the path to heaven, but not how heaven was made, because the entire focus of the Mishkan is to teach us godliness, to teach us a connection with Hashem, to live a Jewish life, and we'll see that godliness that it brought into the world. So just in a brief introduction, a summary, so to speak, of the Parsha, just by way of introduction. So, Hashem commands the Jewish people to build the Mishkan. He gives them exact details, very exactly details how to construct it, how to build it. We learn about the different instruments, the different vessels. We learn about the very complex materials, the gold, the silver, the copper, the blue, the purple, the dyed flax, the goat hair, animal skins, the wood, the olives and spices and gems. It's a very incredible Parsha when it talks about all these beautiful things. And for those of you who are into interior design, this is really the Parsha for you. But the Torah describes how Hashem says to Moshe, right, you shall make me a sanctuary, I'm going to dwell amongst you. And it gives tremendous detail. And I want to share with you 3 principal ideas about this week's Sedra. First one is this very beautiful, famous pasuk. If anyone's ever been to a Sheva Brachot, I'm sure you've heard it said in context of a newly married couple. We say this concept, V'osuli migdash, you shall build for me a temple, V'shochanti b'socham, and I will dwell amongst them in the plural, which is a whole discussion in itself. Why does that become plural? But one of the blessings commonly given to a young married couple, as we say when a couple gets engaged, in the Hasidic world particularly, we say the shidduch should be ole yofeh. It should go up beautifully. Now, it's a strange expression, this ole yofeh. What does it mean, it should go up beautifully? Right? So we know the basic translation, right? Go up well. But actually, it's an awkward wording. What does it mean? So there's a beautiful thought from the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Teitelbaum. He explains it beautifully. He says the word oleh, right, goes up, right? It can often connote a numerical value. What's the numerical value? What's the numerical value of the word yafeh? Right, Yud, Fei, Hey. The numerical value is 95. What's the significance of 95? If you look in the Sefer HaChinuch, there's a beautiful sefer called the Sefer HaChinuch, which describes each and every one of the mitzvot in the Torah. Mitzvah number 95 is this mitzvah of building a sanctuary. And therefore, when he says Ole Yafeh, it should go up beautifully, it should go up to number 95, the home that this young couple should build should be similar to the sanctuary, the temple itself. It should be a place where the Almighty's presence dwells. When you have a Jewish home with a kosher kitchen, with mezuzot on the doors, with Jewish books on the bookshelves, where zmirot are sung on Shabbat, where kosher food is prepared and guests are entertained, this is Ole Yafeh. This is building a sanctuary for God's presence to dwell amongst them. We know there is a whole genre of literature in Jewish thought about the commandments in the Torah. Can anyone just tell us very briefly, how many mitzvot are there in the Torah? Just unmute yourself. How many mitzvot are there in the Torah?
613.
613. 613 mitzvot. Thank you, Nick. 613 mitzvot. However, there is a huge gamut of literature that discusses the order of the mitzvot. What's mitzvah number 1, number 2, number 3? Why is this important is a different question. But we see that if we believe that our life is about doing mitzvot, we want to know the exact order We want to know what is a mitzvah d'oraita, what is a Torah mitzvah, what is a rabbinic mitzvah. We want to understand them in all their beauty and all their depth. And we know from the Gemara in Makot there are 613 mitzvot, as Nick correctly said, known as Tariag mitzvot. But there is lots of discussion amongst the commentators of the various order of the mitzvot. So the Rambam, Maimonides, discusses this very mitzvah. Now, what would you say, and let's get this a bit of discussion involved. If I was to ask you, building the Mishkan, one of the 613 mitzvot? Yes or no?
What's the question?
Is building the Mishkan one of the 613 commandments in the Torah?
Not that I know of, no.
No.
It is. The answer is yes, it is. Building a Mishkan is one of the 613. What about building all the individual articles within the Mishkan? So, for example, the menorah or the Mizbeach, are they each separate mitzvot or not? Gary, what do you say? You've been learning a lot of Rambam. You should know this.
I say they're separate mitzvot.
You say they're separate mitzvot. So, actually, we're going to see what the Rambam says, because the Rambam says he does not count the construction of individual kalim in the Mishkan as independent mitzvot. He includes all of them in the overall mitzvah of building the Mishkan. But he says there is a mitzvah to build an actual Mishkan. Now, what's interesting, I'll read you the Rambam inside. He says, "Our mitzvah estrim, shetivinu lifnos beiso avodah." The 20th mitzvah in the Torah, according to the Rambam, is the 20th commandment. It's to build a beiso avodah, a house of service, the Mishkan. Right? And he describes this as an independent mitzvah to build a Mishkan. Obviously, many of the mitzvahs do not apply nowadays, but in biblical times, in temple times, this was a mitzvah. And he then goes on to say, now each and every one of the artifacts within the Mishkan is included within this mitzvah. Now you may know this, Rambam very, very often argues with the Ramban, Ben Nachman, right? Now it's very interesting. I don't know, for those of you who've been to Jerusalem, there are two roads. There's Rambam and there's Ben Nachman. Now if you ask, there was a survey done some years ago actually asking school children in Jerusalem, what's Rambam? And do you know what they said? Over 30% of them came back and said it's a street in Jerusalem. Now we all know that the Rambam was one of the greatest scholars who ever lived. But what's interesting is that I guess out of Rahman, out of mercy for the taxi drivers, they didn't call the two streets Rambam and Ramban because that would confuse everyone. They called it Rambam and Ben Nachman, right? So the Ramban, that's Ben Nachman with a nun at the end, he agrees with the Rambam. He agrees, and he says the construction of individual kalim in the Mishkan are independent mitzvot. Sorry, one second. Let me just get this right. Sorry. No, he agrees. He agrees that they are not independent mitzvot. And therefore, they also do not count as separate mitzvot. However, he gives a very different reason. And he says that they are what we call in halacha a hechsher mitzvah. Has anyone heard of the concept hechsher mitzvah? If you can figure out what is a hechsher mitzvah, you all know what a hechsher is. If you want to see if an item of food is kosher, it has a hechsher. What do you think a hechsher mitzvah is? Any guesses?
A public mitzvah that has to be authorized by rabbinic authority.
Great guess, Bernard. Great guess and warm. A hechsher mitzvah basically means a prerequisite mitzvah to take place. So let me give you an example. On Hanukkah, it's a mitzvah to light the menorah, right? The hechsher mitzvah, the prerequisite for that mitzvah, is to make a menorah. However, when the man in the silversmith is making a beautiful menorah, he's not doing an actual mitzvah itself by crafting a menorah, right? So too, another example, it's a mitzvah to perhaps, this is a discussion in itself, it's a mitzvah to go to the Mikvah. Is it a mitzvah to build a Mikvah in its own right? Or is that a hechsher mitzvah to allow you to fulfill the mitzvah of going to the mikvah? So the Ramban, Nachmanides, says that all these artifacts in the Mishkan, there's no mitzvah per se to build them. You needed them to be able to do the service of God. So there was no separate mitzvah to build the menorah. Without it, you are unable to, of course, light the menorah. So in summary, right, perhaps let's try and say this very simply, right? The Rambam says the primary objective, and this kind of defines the difference between them. It's very subtle. The primary objective is livnot by beis avodah. Therefore, right, the kalim are peripheral. The main objective is to build a place where Jewish people could go and serve the Almighty. The actual vessels were part and parcel of that. The Ramban says actually no, the Mishkan was there for what reason? To perpetuate the concept of Ma'amad HaSinai, the giving of the Torah. Why did the Almighty give us the Torah? So that there should be a presence of God in this world, so that we should be able to serve Him. And therefore, without these articles, we are less able to serve the Almighty. So that's just by way of introduction, a discussion between whether they're separate mitzvahs or one mitzvah. Either way, we know it's for sure a mitzvah to build the Mishkan, as we see at the beginning of this week's Sedra. Now, the famous verse tells us in this week's Sedra, about Bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel. For those of you who've got Chumash, this is chapter 25, verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel, v'yikhuli Terumah. They should take for me Terumah. Now, Terumah, as we know, is the name of the Sedra. What does Terumah mean?
Offering.
Offering, donation, gift, right? It's a gift. Now, when you go out and buy somebody a gift, do you take a gift or do you give a gift? You normally give a gift. You give it. You don't normally take it. Yet there's a very strange language at the beginning of the 6th It says, "V'yikhuli Terumah." And Rashi, the commentator, says, "Li lishmi." You should do it for my sake. You should do it for the right intentions. Now, I think it's an appropriate time to talk briefly about the mitzvah of charity, because this is really one of the essential sources for charity. You know, I've had various interesting discussions with various businessmen in the community about how to deal with charity during a pandemic. People's businesses are suffering, right? The spreadsheets are not looking great. The income is not looking great. And they're saying, you know, everyone's asking for charity. The charities are suffering during the pandemic. I can't afford to give more. I need to give less. And there are those who say, no, that's the wrong attitude. In Judaism, we give, right? It's an interesting discussion. What do you say during a pandemic? Should philanthropists be giving more or less? They're making less money. It's a tough one.
As much as they can.
As much as they can?
Well,
More than usual?
They're not spending any.
We're not spending it on other things, so perhaps we're saving up, right? Less eating out. Everyone's credit cards bills are a little bit lower than usual. No one's going to Brent Cross. So that perhaps there's more money in the kitty to give tzedakah. The Gemara actually tells us that if one sees that their income is scarce, what should you do to generate more income? Tzedakah. Because we know in Judaism, the more charity you give, the more blessing you receive. And that's the Pashat, that's the explanation of v'yikhuli Terumah. You shall take for me a gift. Because when you're giving, you are the one who is taking. And therefore, as we say, right, the verse in Malachi, right, promises us abundant wealth to anybody who apportions his money for charitable causes. It's very, very interesting. It's a very, very interesting concept. The Maharal, the great Maharal of Prague, explains a beautiful idea. Why is there a promise that somebody who gives more charity will become wealthier? What's the logic? It's completely illogical. If you have £100 in the bank account and you give 50 to charity, you're only left with £50. Why would there be any logic to say you're going to become more wealthy by giving away some of your money? So the Maharal says a beautiful idea. When somebody gives charity, they become a giving person and they resemble the Almighty. The Almighty is the ultimate giver. He gives to all of us perpetually all day long. He's giving and giving and giving. Therefore, somebody changes their character to become a giver, Almighty makes them into a giver, and a giver can't become a taker. And therefore, they're given an assurance never to be in a state of needing to take from others, because they have changed their way, changed their nature to become a giver. There's a very famous pasuk, the pasuk in Mishlei, right? Tzedakah tatzil memoves. We say that charity saves somebody from death. Through giving charity, you are saved. It's a promise in Mishlei from death, and it's a very, very strange promise, also to speak. There's a story told, and my sister-in-law actually told me this in New York. She'd met an older woman near the Kotel, and this elder lady, she was giving charity to everyone. She was famous for never turning anyone away from charity. She would always give them charity. You know, when you go to the Western Wall, it used to be in pre-COVID days, we used to go to Jerusalem, go to the Western Wall, you're bombarded with people asking for charity. My Rabbi in Yeshiva used to say, he said, never turn away a Jew, always try and give. But I said, Rabbi, there's hundreds of people coming from every direction. He says, you know what I do? Before I go to the Western Wall, I take 20 shekel, 10 shekel, and I change them into agarot, which are small denominations of coins. And I give each person a few agarot. And okay, it's not a lot of money, but I'm not turning anyone away. We have this concept of tzedakah tatzal mamoveh. So my sister-in-law was at the Western Wall. She sees this famous lady always giving charity to everybody. And she goes over to her and she says, can you explain to me, why do you do this? What's the reason? She said to him, my dear, about 10, 15 years ago, I was waiting in Machane Yehuda in Jerusalem. I was waiting for a bus. And the bus came and there was a poor person who asked me for a donation. I opened my handbag and I gave this person a few coins. And as I turned around, the bus had driven off and I missed the bus. And I thought to myself, thank you, the Almighty. This is the way you reward me. I give charity and I miss my bus. Thank you very much. Several minutes later, she hears an explosion in downtown Jerusalem. That bus blew up. There's a bomb on that bus. Very, very tragic story, but a very powerful story. She attributed the reason she was saved from that charity was because of the merit of that charitable act she just did. Powerful, interesting story. I think at this point, before I move on to the next section of the show, I'm going to share with you a short clip. I think people like a little video clip for a bit of entertainment value. I've got an amazing clip here that talks about this mitzvah of charity and how important it is to always give, and what an effect it can have, not only immediately, also a longer term effect that it can have on all of us. I'm going to share with you this clip now. I'm hoping you'll be able to see it on your computer, and we'll talk about it straight afterwards. Have a look at this, everybody.
Stuart Mintz was born and raised in Cleveland in the 1950s. For the first 35 years of his life, he had no connection to his heritage.
And was not really interested in pursuing anything other than my bar mitzvah. As soon as I was done with my bar mitzvah, I was basically done with my Jewish education.
But in 1988, Stuart and his friends were offered a subsidized trip to Israel, and they decided to take advantage and go. They arrived very early Friday morning, and before they knew it, Shabbos rolled around.
And I find myself wide awake very, very early in the morning, Shabbos morning. There's nothing to do. Everything is closed down. You can't get a taxi. You can't get a bus. The six of us were just like, what to do today?
One of Stuart's friends gets up and he says, you know, guys, why don't we go shul hopping, synagogue hopping? Let's check out some synagogues in the area.
Go to shul? I don't understand. Go to shul. This is not Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah.
They all walk out of the lobby and they start walking the streets of Yerushalayim. They walk 50 minutes, they pass by dozens of shuls, and suddenly they come to this white building, a big shul, with the windows open, and Stuart can hear people from the inside davening. And he turns to his friends and he says, why don't we walk into this shul and check it out?
That was the very first time I walked into an Orthodox shul. So much so that we were saying, you know, we don't want to look like tourists, like conspicuous and everything, so let's go upstairs.
So they get upstairs, and Stuart leans over the balcony, and what he sees left an indelible impression on him. He saw it for the very first time of his life. He sees people around the bima, wrapped in prayer shawls and talisim, white beards, old ancient Sefer Torah open on the bima, and they're reading from it. And he thinks to himself, wow.
If I can go back into time 2,000 years ago, I would see the exact same sight. A bunch of old men reading these exact words in this exact order at this exact time of the day. That's why we as Jews are still here today.
It was that moment that became a turning point in Stuart's life. He realized how little he knew and how much more he wanted to know, grow, and connect to his heritage.
10 years after I'm already Shomer Shabbos, I'm sitting at this table with my father and mother having Shabbos.
Stuart's father turns to Stuart and he says, Stuart, you know, I don't know if I ever told you the story about your grandmother while you were in the hospital when you were a baby. Stuart was born with a certain illness, a certain blood condition that threatened his life, and he was hospitalized for many weeks when he was born. His grandmother was home in Cleveland, and she hears a knock on the front door. She opens the door, and she sees this young rabbi who introduces himself as Menachem Mendel Taub, the Kaleva Rebbe. He survived the Holocaust, Auschwitz, originally from Hungary, and he came to settle in Cleveland. And he opened this shul, and they were looking to buy a Sefer Torah.
So she says, how much is the Torah? She says, well, the Torah is going to cost $3,500. So my grandmother says, if you promise on the very first Shabbos to do a special Mishuberach V'Chola, Yisroel Eliezer Ben Zev, that's me, I'll buy you that Torah. So my grandmother wrote a check to this young rabbi for $3,500. And obviously he said the Mishuberach, and here I am today.
So he asked his father, he says, Dad, whatever happened to that Sefer Torah?
He told me that the rabbi, with a number of his balabatim, made joint aliyah to Israel and took the entire shul, lock, stock, and barrel, including the Torah, and they moved to Israel.
At this point, Stuart cannot believe his ears. He's thinking to himself, wait a second. There was a Sefer Torah in Israel 10 years ago that changed my life.
Is it possible that that Torah that was being read at the time that started this whole process was the Torah that my grandmother actually bought? In my mind and heart, I know that's the Torah, because it makes no sense that this would have happened to me, but for that fact.
You know, the pasuk says, Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikin ba. The Torah is a tree of life for anyone who supports it, anyone who connects to it, anyone who learns it. So many years ago, Stuart's grandmother decided to support the Torah by giving $3,500 to the Kaleva Rebbe, and that saved Stuart's life twice, once physically and once spiritually. Connect to it, learn it, support it, because ultimately you will realize that it will support you.
Very, very beautiful story, but with a very powerful message. This idea that when you really give, it's really your taking, because it brings with it so many blessings into your life. And I thought that was just a powerful story to summarize this exact point that we just said. But moving on, I want to share with you something slightly deeper, a really beautiful idea about this very verse. You know, it's a very interesting Gemara in Kiddushin. Gemara tells us that when a man marries a woman, how does a man marry a woman? What does he need to give her? Anyone know? What does a man need to give a woman to be married? Under the chuppah, he hands her something.
Ring.
He gives her a ring. The halacha is when he
A ring
hands her a
worth a
ring,
pruta.
it needs to be worth a shava pruta. It's worth a pruta, exactly right. Well done. And the Gemara tells us something very, very interesting. That if a woman, what happens, Gary? You've learned all of Kiddushin. If instead of the man giving the woman a ring, if the woman gives the man something of value, is that enough?
I wouldn't have thought so.
You wouldn't have thought so, but there's an exception. The exception is an Adam Choshev, a very important person. Let me explain what I mean. You know, some years ago, we went up for the winter holidays to Sandringham, and we went and we met some of the royal family. It was a very exciting day. We stood outside on freezing cold on the 25th of December, and as they were walking down the road, members of the public could greet them. And my son Yosef, then aged 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old, he drew a picture. And he handed it to William and Kate. And it was a very special moment. We've got a video and a photo of it. And if you go to Kensington Palace, an original Yosef Golker hangs there, I'm sure, no doubt. But who gains more out of that experience? Was it my son Yosef, or was it the Duchess and Duke? What do you think?
Both of them.
Well, it was certainly my son, right? For him, it was very, very memorable. Imagine you give the President of the United States, you meet Joe Biden, and you give him a pen. And he takes this fountain pen, and then you see on the news later, he's signing a very important letter with the pen that you have given him. You reap a tremendous benefit. Gemara says that if a woman hands a man something of value, and that man is what we call an Adam Chashuv, a very important person, she can be married through that mechanism. Why? Because really the man has given her something of value. Through his acceptance of that gift, she is so chuffed. She therefore feels so lucky, and so she feels that she's gained something. There can be an actual kiddushin. There can be a wedding transaction having taken place through that act. And there's a beautiful sefer, a very, very famous sefer you may have heard of, called the Shev Shmeitzer. The Shev Shmeitzer is a very sophisticated and deep, classic sefer learned in the yeshiva world, very hard and in-depth sefer. And it describes this exact pasuk over here. It says, "V'yichlu li truma," you will take truma. What does it mean you'll take? Really, by giving to the Almighty, you are taking. You're just like that bride giving the Adam Chashuv, the important person, something. There's one condition, says the Gemara. The condition is, as long as it's not almanat lahachse, you cannot return it. In other words, you're giving them that permanently. So long as the gift is outright, it's given forever, then it's a real kiddushin, it's a real wedding transaction. So too, when somebody makes a donation to charity, it needs to be done for the right reasons, and that's what it means when Rashi says li lishmi. It needs to be given for the right purpose. You're doing it for God's sake, not for your own sake. There are some people who will only donate when they get something back in return, whether it be a plaque, whether it be acknowledgement, etc., etc. But the real ultimate way of giving, says the Parsha, is li lishmi. It's giving it for altruistic purposes. Let's conclude with one final beautiful short idea. This is the idea of the kruvim. Now, you know, the Torah tells us that on top of the ark in the Holy of Holies, there were two kruvim. They were like childlike cherub figures. And it's a beautiful symbol, a symbol of the future, symbol of chinuch, of education, of Judaism being able to survive through the children. It's a very, very beautiful symbol. Now, it's an interesting thing. Does anyone know? This is a really hard trivia question for you. I think, Gary, you might even not handle this one. Where else in the Torah, apart from the whole discussion of the sanctuary, we see the concept of kruvim, of these cherub-like figures? Can anyone think of anywhere else in the Torah we learn about the kruvim?
What about the guardians at the Garden of Eden with their revolving fiery swords?
Wow, Gary, 10 out of 10. You've impressed me this evening. Excellent. Absolutely correct. In Genesis, Parsha chapter 3, verse 24, the Torah tells us that man was driven out of the Garden of Eden, eastwards, and the cherubs, the fiery, ever-turning swords, were there guarding the tree of life. Absolutely correct. Now, why am I mentioning this tonight? If you think about it, it's so strange. You've got two completely opposite symbols. In our Sedra, you've got the symbol of beauty, of education, of holiness, of purity. And in Genesis, in Bereshit, you've got the symbol of violence, death, bloodshed, swords by the Garden of Eden. What's going on? Are the kruvim the protectors of holiness, or are they a symbol of destruction and death? Which one is it? I had a beautiful idea that actually, this is actually what children are all about. Children are malleable. Children can have two very different outcomes depending on what you put into them. You can have the exact same child who can be that cherub and symbol of purity and innocence and holiness, or you can have that child who can be a symbol of destruction and fieriness and all sorts of negativity. But it depends what goes into them. There's a beautiful story told with the Chofetz Chaim. In fact, there was once a rabbi giving a shiur in Miami, and in the shiur he told this story that there was a yeshiva bocher, a student in Radin, in the yeshiva, who was once caught smoking on Shabbat. Can you imagine in the Chofetz Chaim's yeshiva 100 years ago in Radin, smoking on Shabbos? They didn't know what to do. They took this boy in to see the Chofetz Chaim. He spent 5-10 minutes inside with the Chofetz Chaim, and he came out a changed boy. And the story ends that he became great. He changed his ways. And as this rabbi told this story, he ended the class in Miami. This was about probably 30 years ago. An elderly man came over to him, And he said to this rabbi, I need to tell you, I was that boy. I was that boy with the Chofetz Chaim. And the man was shocked. He said, tell me, what did the Chofetz Chaim say to you behind closed doors in his office in those 5-10 minutes that changed your life? What was it that he said to you? Tell me. And the old man turned to him and he said, you know, the Chofetz Chaim was a much shorter man than me. I was a tall boy. And I went into his office. He took hold of my hands and he just repeated the word Shabbos. And he started to cry. And the warm tears fell down his cheek onto my hands and it penetrated my soul. It made a huge impact on me. And I thought to myself, I just can't do this anymore. The Chofetz Chaim, you know, it just penetrated something in my soul and I changed my ways. But why am I telling you this story? Because children are affected by their whereabouts. Sometimes they can be given a sword. Sometimes they can become totally pure. They can become placed on top of the ark in the Holy of Holies. But that all depends on how we influence them and how we influence our surroundings. So that concludes this evening's Parsha share. I've got one short idea if you want on Parshat Zachor, for those who wish to stay, and then I will open up if anyone has any questions. I promised at the beginning I'd say one short idea on Zachor. You know, this week's Sedra is Terumah, but at the end of the Shabbos before Purim is called Parshat Zachor, where there's a very important mitzvah to try and hear the Torah reading. And if you can get to Shul, that will be excellent. We're going to also have some outdoor readings in St. John's Wood. People who don't feel comfortable to come inside, but it's very important to try if you can. Obviously, if you can't, you can't, but you try your best if you can to hear this Torah reading. And the last verse that we read, it says, remember that which Amalek did to you, right? On your way out from Egypt. Now, if you think about it, the verse seems a little bit strange. The verse starts in the singular. Remember, that God, what they did to you, singular. And then it says, when they, the Jewish people, left Egypt. Why does it switch mid-sentence from singular to plural? Furthermore, in this week's Sedra, in Parshat Terumah, we learn about the precious stones in the Choshen. What was the Choshen? The Choshen was the breastplate worn by the Kohen Gadol in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan. And each of those stones, they're called the Avnei Miluim, the filling stones. Literally like a filling, they were filled in with precious stones. Now, if you think about it, it's a very, very strange name. These were beautiful, beautiful stones with inherent value, right? Gold, silver, blue, purple, beautiful, beautiful stones. Why are they called the filling in stones? You know, they're filling a gap. Imagine you have a beautiful engagement ring with a big diamond. Oh, that's a useful diamond. It's the filling in diamond. It's filling in the gap in the gold ring. Makes no sense. Why do we call it the filling in stones? So Reb Shmuel Bambam, who's a great, great tzaddik, he says that true value doesn't just come from external beauty, but rather from making something or somebody else whole, right? Other materials have value, but when you use that value to make something else complete, that is true beauty. And that was what the Miluim were. Completed the breastplate. They made something else feel complete. Similarly, Amalek, the words of Amalek, right? They wanted to attack the nation of Israel at the beginning of the verse when they were singular. When we are individual, when we are fragmented, when we are subgrouped, when we are just one out of the entire people, that's when we are in danger of being attacked by Amalek. But then at the conclusion of the verse, Moshe relates to in order to defeat Amalek, we need to switch from the singular to the plural. That's how we're going to be able to destroy. And that's why the Avnei Miluim, they filled in, because once they filled in, it became whole. It was a symbol of unity. Each of the tribes of Israel that represented by a different stone, that when they were whole, that was the ultimate beauty. So in order to merit this idea of Purim, it's remembering this idea of Jewish unity, which is so much what Purim is about, giving matanat lev yonim, giving gifts to others. Obviously, this year one has to be very careful how they do that socially distanced. And obviously, we need to make sure we are very, very careful that correctly. But I wish you all Shabbat Shalom. I wish you all happy Purim. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself before we conclude.
Isn't the breastplate in Tetzaveh as opposed to Teruma?
It's also mentioned, it's mentioned in both places. So if you look in chapter 25, verse 7,
Right.
It's mentioned here as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're right. It does go into more detail in the later Parshiot. Before Parshiot, through all the detail of Mishkan and the artifacts within it. Yeah.
Thank you, Yoni, very much indeed. Very
Lovely to
interesting.
see you. Thank you all for joining. I wish you good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining, and
And
see you all in
you.
shul or next time online. Okay. All the best.
Thanks,
Okay.
Yoni. Koyach. See you
Thanks,
tomorrow
Yoni.
morning.
Thanks. Night.
He is such a nice
Thank you, Rav Yoni.
Okay.